I think because we're public policy folks, it is our charge to do research, but it's also our charge to try to get that research and that evidence in the hands of people who make the decisions to hopefully help them make better informed decisions that perhaps will meet the interests of people that they represent.
I'm JB Wogan from Mathematica, and welcome back to On the Evidence, a show that examines what we know about today's most urgent challenges and how we can make progress in addressing them. This is the second part of a two-part episode about Abigail Aiken, this year's recipient of the David N. Kershaw Award and Prize, which recognizes early career professionals for their contributions to research and public policy. It is among the largest and most prestigious awards of its kind, honoring Mathematica's first president, David Kershaw. Part 1 of this episode features an address Abigail gave in receiving the award at a recent conference hosted by the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management. It's an entertaining and poignant talk about her personal and professional journey, explaining how she became interested in researching self-managed abortions through telemedicine, and then how she has engaged with policymakers about her findings. The second part, which you're listening to now, is about that engagement piece. After she publishes her findings, how does she ensure that they don't go unread and ignored? It's worth noting here that Abigail is active in speaking with policymakers and the media. For example, in 2018, she provided testimony to the Irish Parliament on the prevalence and safety of self-managed abortion through telemedicine in Ireland, which informed language on a future national referendum. In 2020, her works on the impacts of restrictive state abortion policy was cited by the U.S. Supreme Court as key evidence in cases that proved decisive for maintaining abortion rights at the time in Texas and Louisiana. And in 2021, her research on the safety and effectiveness of telemedicine was cited by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration as part of the basis for its landmark decision to remove the in-person dispensing requirements for mifepristone. She has also been the subject of a New Yorker profile and has been quoted in prominent media outlets, including the Associated Press, Reuters, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Economist, and the Wall Street Journal, which is all to say she has a proven track record of extending the reach of her work beyond peer-reviewed journals to ensure policy impact. We'll start with a few curated questions Abigail answered from audience members after her address at the research conference, including one from me. Then we'll switch to a brief interview that Abigail and I squeezed in between her talk and the award ceremony. You'll have to forgive the background noise. The only way that we could record the interview that day was to forego a formal studio and talk in an empty room where she had just given her address. By the way, the Mathematica blog that accompanies this episode will include transcripts for both parts 1 and 2. We'll include more information about the Kershaw Award, Abigail's work, and our previous podcast interviews with Kershaw Award winners. I hope you find both parts of the episode interesting and useful.
What you're doing is courageous. I mean, it's amazing. But my question for you is, as a researcher, there's that line between research and advocacy, and I'm sure that's always top of mind for you of how do you stay unbiased when you can see, very clearly what the answer is. And, can you just talk about any struggles that you might have in that and, how you've navigated that?
Thank you. It's such a good question. It's something I think about a lot. I mean, I think everybody probably has their own position, right, on this topic and on any topic that you go to research. And this is a particularly charged one. I think that for me, it's important to acknowledge that, I having grown up in Ireland, have experienced this myself. And that, puts me in a place, I think, of empathy for other people. But it also means that I certainly do have strong feelings about it. At the same time, though, I think it would be disingenuous for me to sort of say, I do this research from a completely neutral standpoint in terms of my personal feelings. But when it comes to analyzing data, that's where I think it's important, right? That you don't let the questions that you choose or the way that you analyze your data or the way that you talk about your data become the same thing as your own personal feelings. And that's partly why I sort of began this with thinking around the subject of abortion and how many people feel complicated about it or they have very strong feelings. And so... yeah, I think trying to pretend that you're totally neutral is not a good idea when you're not, but at the same time, not allowing that to affect the sorry, I'm struggling for words. This is a sleep deprivation. Can I say genuity? The way that you analyze your data, the way that you think about it. You obviously, one day, I guess my biggest fear is that I will come up with a research finding that I didn't want to see. And the ethical question there is, what do you do with that? Do you stick it in a desk drawer and pretend you didn't see it? Or do you send it out there? Because it's no surprise to you, probably the research community in which I operate is also one that I think oftentimes feels quite attacked, feels, quite protective of this subject. And what do you do when you have findings that you don't like? My answer to that is you publish them and you talk about them because you have to. That's what research is. You need to be, I'm first and foremost a researcher on this. But I had an interesting conversation once on a plane. I was heading to Ireland. In fact, it was going to the Citizens Assembly, and I was sitting on a plane beside a guy, and I was working on my slides still for going to this thing. I know. And he's kind of looking over and he goes, I couldn't help but notice. And I was like, you totally could help but notice, but you were looking at my slides. And he goes, do you work for a pro-life organization? And I thought, I wonder what about my slides makes you think that, because they're not biased anyway. I'm not going out there saying, that Ireland should do anything in particular. I'm just giving the evidence, and politicians are going to come to their own decision on that. But I wondered why he said that. And I said, no, actually, I'm a researcher. I don't, advocate one way or the other. I'm just here with my evidence and my data. And he goes, oh, because I'm a sidewalk counselor for the last abortion clinic in Mississippi. I live there and I'm very religious and I go there every day and I, talk to people about what they're doing and how, awful it is. Like, how could you conscience this? And I try to help them to understand what it is they're doing. And this was so interesting, right? And I just could not, I couldn't resist just talking with him. I really wanted to hear how it was that he'd come to do this, how, he felt about it. And he was very, 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 I think heartfeltly believed that he was doing the right thing, right? For him, it was that these, babies are going to be murdered. And if I don't try to stop that, I'm part of it. I'm complicit, right? I haven't intervened. I haven't acted. And so I must do this work. And, we talked and I said to him, I see that. And I wonder, if that abortion clinic were to get shut down, what do you think that people would do? And we started talking about self-managed abortion. It was really interesting. And he was like, oh, I didn't know that people did that. And I was like, yeah, we're kind of just, we know it happens, but we're trying to put some data to this. And we actually had a very civil, the people around us were probably just sitting there going, please stop talking about this. Like, what are you doing? But I really, I wanted to hear what he had to say. I think part of it is wanting to hear what other people who don't agree with you have to say. And I really do. I like knowing that because then I know, something that's not my own opinion, right? Because I do support abortion rights and I do think the evidence is in favor of that. But at the same time, I understood where he was coming from. And we came to a place where he said, you know what, maybe shutting down that clinic wouldn't be such a good idea. And I said, I'm with you on that. I don't think it would. I think people, who want to do that, who have the choice. And he said, yeah. And, I'll be there to talk to them and to try to explain to them why they're not doing the right thing. And I thought, well, that's probably as close to, getting there as we're ever gonna get with you, but it was very interesting. And so for me, I think it's about trying to remain open-minded about things, trying to always question, am I asking the right questions? Am I fairly analyzing my data? And when I do have a finding that I don't, really wish that I found, being brave enough to go out there and say, here it is, and what do we make of this? That was very long-winded, I'm sorry, but there it is. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing today. I know there's been a couple of questions about this and you've spoken to, and I'm sitting in this tension around being seeing our research as neutral and apolitical, because I don't think that's actually possible.
Right.
We bring all of who we are, our beliefs, our identities. And I think in this topic specifically, I worry about making statements like that because it is so racialized. Mm-hmm. It's gendered beyond the binary. Mm-hmm. There's so many implications. And so as I know people are saying, like, this should be neutral, but none of our research is. We bring all of our biases. And so I'm just wondering, how do you negotiate that? And at what point do you make a statement about, this is my research and this is what I want to do, this is what I stand for? And I know that it's difficult when you're trying to influence policy, but that happens across the policy spectrum. And so just wondering kind of how you grapple with those things.
Yeah, I mean, let me try and clear the baby fog a little bit so that I can answer this. I know I've been asked it already and I'm trying to sort of get my thoughts together on it. So here's what I would say. I'm pretty much in agreement with you that the questions you choose to ask, the experiences that you have in your life, the people that you know and talk to and engage with, all of that will be brought to bear on what you choose to study and how you choose to study it, right? The very fact that I'm asking questions to these folks and not, as the point was made over here, trying to engage with science on, for example, what we can determine about fetuses and fetal consciousness. I'm not in that area, right? I still want to know about it, but certainly these questions are the ones that I choose to ask. And I must say, I think you may have come across it, you may not. I've been upfront about my own experience with self-managed abortion as a teenager in Ireland. I do come out of that context, and I think I understand what it is to go through that. So that does definitely influence how I perceive this, what I expect to find in my analyses. I think you're right. You can't divorce yourself and sort of say, oh, I'm going to study abortion from a totally neutral lens, and I'm going to pretend like I don't have any experiences or feelings or empathy for anybody. You're right. So I do bring all of that. But at the same time, I think where it really matters is in terms of what you do with the research and how you go about your analyses, right? If I went into this and promised, Women on Web that, look, if I find that this is really not safe and effective, I'm not going to publish that, right? That's where I start to see the difficulty, right? That you would, not want to see a certain thing and therefore you're going to just completely close your mind to it. Or people were saying, this is actually a horrible experience and I wish I'd never done it, right? If that happens, you have to be truthful about it and you have to include it in your results. And then I think when you come to talk to people in the political sphere about this, it's going to be, as you say, obvious to them when you're bringing this research. The fact that you do research this, it probably, at least signals that you are comfortable in some way with abortion. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't want to research this at all, or you might take a different approach to it. But at the same time, I think then it becomes important to try to engage with other perspectives. I think that's the best that I found that I can do is to say, look, I acknowledge that I have experiences and I choose to ask certain questions. And I even have ideas about what probably is the right policy to go for. But at the same time, I don't come in saying y'all are absolutely wrong for, having your total abortion ban. How could you be so, ridiculous? Because that's not going to help. If I come in and say that, and if I don't try to, really understand that there are people out there who have, really, really strong opinions about this in other ways, then I can't talk about it with anybody. And I think maybe if you look at the way we talk about abortion in media, it's very, very polarized, right? You either have to be all for it or all against it. And I think the reality for a lot of folks out there is that, not everybody, but for some folks, is that it is more complicated than that. And so the best I can do, I think, and to answer this question is to say I try to remain open-minded and I try not to come into a room with the attitude that my way is the only way and that I know what's right, because I can't speak for everybody. And I also can't persuade people of facts that they may want to hear if I come in saying, you're ridiculous and I don't hear your opinion.
So
I noticed that both in your remarks and then in some of your research, you use storytelling quite effectively. The qualitative testimonials from women's experiences, but also, everything from the story of you sashaying on the dance floor to meet Dr. Gombert to the young man you met on the airplane. I was just wondering if you could speak to how you think about and use storytelling in policy research and what the role is of storytelling in policy research.
Thank you, JB. That's a really interesting question. I think that it you're right. I never really thought about it, but it is really important to what I do, and I do use it a lot. I think it's an Irish thing too. I think we like to talk about our stories in Ireland, and usually you'll sit down and the person beside you will be somewhere related to you as well, and you're like, oh yeah, your Aunt Mary, yeah, knows my Uncle Tom. It's very much an Irish thing, but I think as well, it's really important to understand when walking into a policy arena that you as a researcher I as a researcher oftentimes love to talk in numbers, right? I love to talk with my colleagues about my analysis. I didn't present anything methodologically complicated today, but I like to talk about those things. I like to talk with my statistical colleagues about how I should do things, what they think. And when you come into a political sphere, and this was the case in the Irish Parliament for sure, the quantitative stuff was definitely received, like people were hearing it, but the stories, I think, were really what persuaded folks, right? Because that connection to a person out there, to be able to say, I am sitting here in charge of making this policy, and you can give me numbers, and that is good, but to really understand what people are experiencing, I think for a lot of folks, particularly folks who go into politics, because you have to be interested in some level in other people to do that. Otherwise you wouldn't do it. And I think for some folks to have heard about people's experiences was really what swayed them more than the idea that, yeah, this is happening and you haven't managed to stop it. Some folks were on that page. For other folks, it was like, well, I really didn't realize what people were going through. The other side of that, of course, is that when you walk into that kind of arena, there was a worry in my mind that what if I come in here and say that this is happening and all of a sudden these people in front of me say, well, we'll start cracking down on this. Like, we didn't know it was happening, so we're going to really start enforcing it, right? It's a risk that you take when you come into the environment. So my judgment of it, having done some sort of back researching with the politician who invited me, was that was probably not going to happen. And I would, of course, not want to have been responsible for that. But it's also the idea of self-censorship, right? As I said, not a single person who'd experienced this was in the room. Either a negative experience or a positive experience, a person who'd remained pregnant and perhaps found that was in the end a good experience for them, or a person who'd had an abortion. None of those folks were there. And I think the power of storytelling in terms of trying, obviously you can't represent everybody, but to try to at least get some human element to this, I think help people to see that perhaps at least people with the capacity to become pregnant were not being served well by the law.
Hi, listeners. We're switching now to my interview with Abigail, so the rest of the questions will be exclusively from me, and you might notice a slight change in the mics. Okay, back to the show. I noticed that you have sections on your research group's website about policy impact and media coverage, and I think that's a reflection of just how active you are at engaging with policymakers and the media in your work. So I have a couple questions. Like, big picture, how do you think about the importance of engaging with policymakers and engaging with the media? And then I'd also be interested in sort of the nitty-gritty elements, like how much time do you allot in a given week or a month to those activities, which I assume are in some ways in competition with the core research work that you're doing?
Yes, particularly at times when states like Texas, act to ban abortion at 6 weeks gestation, or when the Supreme Court decides to overturn Roe v. Wade. Those are intense times. I will field maybe 30 to 40 media calls in a week sometimes, or email requests, and it does get quite intense. But I think that because I'm in a public policy school and because that's my profession, I see it as part of the work. I think because we're public policy folks, it is our charge to do research, but it's also our charge to try to get that research and that evidence in the hands of people who make the decisions to hopefully help them make better informed decisions that perhaps will meet the interests of people that they represent. And so so to me, engaging with the media or talking with colleagues outside of the academic setting is a really key part of what I would call my research writ large. And so it can be very tough to make time for it, especially if, for example, a research paper is hitting or something is happening in the policy world and you're getting requests coming from all directions. But I really try to meet as many of those as I can with interview if that's requested. And it's also important, sometimes you'll get media requests from outlets that you perceive perhaps would be less receptive to the evidence that you have. And those are also important to do because, if you're just always talking, for example, to the New York Times, and a lot of the readers there are already going to be on the same page as your evidence, it's not as impactful as being able to perhaps reach an audience that doesn't have a preconceived idea, or perhaps is a preconceived idea that looks very different to what your research might suggest be the best course of action. So I try to engage with many different media outlets when they will have me.
And do you actually set aside, I'm going to set aside 10 hours a week? I interviewed someone, Jennifer Doliak at Texas A&M, where she actually, that's her model. She tries to carve out a certain discrete period of time per week for those kinds of activities.
I wish I were that organized.
Okay.
I think for me, I am very much a sort of pick one and get it done person. So I don't have a set schedule. I'll sort of make a priority list of things as they come along, and I will try to fit it around. For example, the last couple of months has been very busy since the overturn of Roe, and at that time I was at the very late stages of pregnancy, and then I had my newborn, and I would tell reporters, you know what? If you can give me your number, I will call you when I have a sleeping baby or when I have a free hand.
Yeah. So that makes sense. I guess it makes sense that also that as there are policy events, that there may be sort of rises and falls in terms of your engagement. I have a related question about interacting with policymakers in the media, which is, do you calibrate your language or your framing for those audiences? What has past experience taught you about those audiences' needs and priorities that might be different from, say, speaking at a research conference? This one is at least a policy research conference, but is there anything you do differently when you're trying to address those audiences?
Well, I think that it's quite important to not assume that the person you're talking to knows what a self-managed abortion is even, for example. Quite often the calls of media will begin with just a question or a sort of a statement about what a self-managed abortion is so that we're on the same page. Quite often I think people are not familiar with the term, or they have a preconceived idea of what it means. And so making sure they understand what I'm actually talking about is always my first step. Then there's the idea that oftentimes people will want me to opine on something that I think pushes me into the advocacy territory a little too far. And while I think that anytime you're bringing evidence into the policy sphere, you are in some sense advocating for something, right? Because you want your research to be used. You probably have a clear idea of what your evidence is telling you. So you can't not, in some ways, advocate for a policy to be constructed a certain way, or perhaps to move away from a particular kind of policy. But at the same time, I tend to not want to, opine on, for example, let me see, what's a good example? Oftentimes people will ask me what aid access is doing right, and I'm not going to have an opinion on that question. It's not my place to say whether aid access is doing something right or wrong. I'm here with some data that I can tell you. I can tell you what that speaks to, but I don't wade into sort of the more opinion-based discussions.
Okay, and maybe I'm misremembering this, but I think you gave an example during your talk about the decision to have the 12 weeks be the cutoff in Ireland, and that was something where the details of exactly what the amendment should be you weren't necessarily recommending a specific threshold. Right,
exactly. Yeah. With coming with that data to Ireland, I think the main points I wanted to get across were, if a total ban on abortion is what you're going for, that hasn't happened, and that it has to, I think, be realized that the law does have negative impacts on people who are seeking abortion for pregnancies that they don't want. But at the same time, if they had asked me what's the right gestation limit to go for, I don't have any evidence that speaks to that. I think we can look at national evidence from other places and say that, most people are not choosing to have later abortions. People tend to want to have abortions as early as they can to deal with their unintended pregnancy quickly. But at the same time, no, I did not, if they didn't ask me, but I wouldn't have felt comfortable going further than the evidence that I had with me on the day.
We actually heard this in some of the questions after your talk, but I hear more and more about the importance of lived experience in informing policy research. How has the experience of now going through pregnancy and becoming a parent informed your work? And I think you also talked about, both in the talk and the New Yorker profile, about the experience of going through a self-managed abortion. But just those different experiences, it does seem like it would be valuable. It's an expertise that you bring to the work.
Yes, I think a couple of things there. It's such an interesting question. One is that I think it makes me less able to understand the kinds of policies that you see Texas and other states enact that seem to be directed at trying to educate women and people that can become pregnant about what an abortion is. I think if you have been through pregnancy, birth, and if you have a child, you understand exactly what pregnancy is, and you understand that an abortion is going to end your pregnancy. So the idea that, for example, compulsory viewing of an ultrasound or having to listen to fetal heart auscultation is going to teach a person who has had a child or has been pregnant something they don't already know, I think is very misguided. You hear politicians say, well, if only these people realized what they were doing, they wouldn't choose this. I don't think that's the case. I think that if you've been through pregnancy and childbirth, and I think that it's quite cruel to require somebody then to view ultrasounds or to hear fetal heart auscultations. Of course, if they want to, I think they should be allowed to, but I think that the idea that you require it is actually quite a cruel thing to do to people. I think it's also the case that there is something for me, now having had my own children, that makes abortion sadder. I think I have to be very honest and say that I feel like it's a sad thing for me, but at the same time, I also recognize that that's not everyone's opinion, and that just because I think that it's sad doesn't mean that people shouldn't be allowed to make their own reproductive choices about their own bodies. I think it's very interesting to feel that way because it kind of puts me in a position where, I'm not sort of saying, there's absolutely nothing, sad about this, or that it should always be something that people do. But at the same time, I think it's so interesting how that has also made me very, very cognizant of the fact that that perspective should not be imposed upon anybody else. So it's very interesting. I think it's also the case that having been through some of the very difficult parts of pregnancy and childbirth, that it is also very much more apparent to me why people cannot be compelled to do this against their will. I think it's a very cruel thing. It can be an extremely hard thing for a body to do, for a person to come to terms with mentally. There's great joys, but there's also a lot of really, really hard parts to this too. And the idea of it being forced upon someone to be a parent or to go through childbirth or to be pregnant, I think when you've done those things yourself, you can really feel viscerally what that would mean for someone and can be empathetic to that.
There was a statement, I think it was the kicker, the final line of the New Yorker story, where you say something along the lines of, in order for parenthood to be a choice, access to abortion has to be available. Something like abortion has to be accessible or has to be legal. Is that a turn? Is that something you always knew, or is that something that has sort of been more of an epiphany after you became a parent?
Great question. I think that it did become crystallized for me, having become a parent, because it really hits home to you that the opposite, the other side of the coin of the choice to have abortion is also the choice to be a parent. And I think choosing to be a parent is very important in terms of how you then are able to cope with all the big changes that are going to be in your life. I myself, with particularly my first pregnancy, it was a very big surprise. It was not a planned or intended pregnancy. And I was sitting there in Texas with this positive pregnancy test going, whoa, this is not what I expected to see on the stick right now. And it became really apparent to me that actually having the choice of what to do about this was partly what really led me to say, no, I'm going to, in this case, parent. I'm going to have this pregnancy and hopefully parent, if everything goes well. But it really hit home to me in that moment that abortion is a choice to end a pregnancy, but it also creates the choice to parent. And that was extremely important to me. And I think partly having grown up in that Irish context where there wasn't a choice afforded to someone really made that important to me.
You had asked about, or you talked about the research in Ireland, some findings about feelings of isolation, that even women who were able to use women on web, that there were still kind of social emotional consequences or costs. Is that going to be an area of future research now with women who are using this in states where abortion is illegal? Are we going to need to document sort of what happens to women who still, or I guess I should say pregnant people and women who are able to have safe abortions through this mechanism, but it's not as simple as, well, then everything's hunky-dory because they're able to have abortions?
Yes, I think we are wanting to document that. And we have some research where we've interviewed folks who've used the service to ask them about that experience. And some of those same themes, I didn't have time to present it here today, but some of those same themes around, disconnect from in-person advice or help if they needed it in the formal healthcare setting, or being very afraid to talk to anybody in case of judgment or worse, actual reporting to the authorities, came to the fore for people. And so that isolation, that stress, the also trying of things that perhaps would be less safe for a person or less effective before finding aid access, those are all themes that came out in our first sort of look at this kind of qualitative data here in the US. And I think it is so important to document because there is a sense in which someone might say, well, if people are just getting around an abortion law by self-managing, then is that the solution? Are we done there? Is that the end of the story? And I think it's not, right? Because I think what we have to see is that there's not any one kind of abortion that's going to work for everybody. For a lot of people, there's a way in which they see this process going, or that it's very important to them that it go a certain way, be that in a clinic, be that in their own home. There's a complexity to this that I don't think we hear talked about because we don't talk about abortion a lot outside of certain spaces. And I think that research needs to speak to that, to try to sort of say, I suspect we might find something similar to Ireland, which is that people are grateful they have some option, but that for some people, the self-management process did not meet their needs or was not the way in which they would have preferred to carry out this kind of care.
Okay, I'm mindful of time. So thank you so much for talking with me. Thank you for your research on this really important topic. And thanks for being willing to talk with me in the midst of, you're very much in demand and also, sleep deprived and all of that.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thanks for listening to our two-part episode about Abigail Aiken, the 22nd winner of the David N. Kershaw Award and Prize. My Mathematica colleague Rick Stoddard produced this episode. Part 1 of this episode, which features Abigail's remarks at the Fall Research Conference hosted by the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management, is also available now. You can find it on your favorite podcasting app or the blog associated with this episode at mathematica.org. To stay up to date on future episodes of On the Evidence, the Mathematica podcast, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, or follow us on Twitter. I'm at JB Wogan. Mathematica is at Mathematica Now.